If I didn't hit start, we'd be in trouble. All right. How's everyone doing? Everyone have a nice Pesach, I hope? Yes? Has everyone already begun feasting on their handouts now that we're out of Passover mode? Well, remember, it's not a mitzvah to eat chametz. You're allowed to gently ease yourself back into it. All right. So, as those of you who were here in the room saw, we began with a little computer problem, just trying to get things working. How many people here actually talk to their computer while they're trying to get it to work? Does that work? No? How many people have little rituals of what they do when the computer's not working? You know, it's, if you unplug it, you plug it in again, you pick up the mouse and shake it as though somehow that's going to change what the reaction is. Or one of my favorites, there was a great little comic online the other day where you just sit there, keep clicking the mouse over and over again. And the little comic said, "Congratulations, you've clicked 3,784 times. This has unlocked the program, and now it will work." As though somehow, if you just keep clicking, eventually it's going to work. What we have little rituals that we do. We have little superstitions that we use. And I bet most of you, whether you keep these superstitions or not, are probably aware of them. Right? If you spill salt, you throw some over your shoulder. Thank you. If a mirror breaks, then you know 7 years of bad luck. Right? If you step on a crack, break your mother's back. I said that specifically. My mother's in the room, so
That's why you're walking.
Walking under a ladder would, of course, lead to bad luck. A black cat crossing your path would lead to bad luck, right? The Bubba mice is the superstitions, but we know them pretty well, right? What happens if a stray drop of milk flies into the pot of chicken soup that you're cooking? Straight drop of milk. You're over on the other side of the house, whipping up your whipped cream, and it goes. Boom.
Is it chicken or is it beef?
What?
Is it chicken soup or beef soup?
That's chicken soup.
Oh.
Or beef soup. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Wait. We had unanimity when we said spilt salt. Right? Everyone knew immediately what to do. Everybody knows immediately what to do with a broken mirror. Everybody knows immediately you stay away from going under ladders, black cats, all that stuff. We got it. Kosher? This we have, throw it away, don't throw it away. It depends how much there is. I mean, come on, really?
Chicken.
Well, yeah. And part of that has to do with the psychology. What happens if you spill the salt and don't throw something over?
Nothing.
No. I mean, what according to the superstition happens? You have bad luck. What happens if you walk under a ladder? Bad luck. What happens if you break that mirror? Famously for 7 years. We are extremely punctilious about trying to avoid bad luck. Trying to follow the mitzvot, usually a little bit less. So let's see, first of all, what some of these mitzvot are regarding kashrut, and then we're going to look at a concept of whether or not following the mitzvot of kashrut can have greater consequences than just you didn't follow the laws of kashrut. Sound like a plan? Excellent. So we are in Parashat Shemini. You're a week ahead of yourself. It's Tazria B'Tzorah next week. We're in Shemini this week. And we're actually going to be looking near the end of Shemini, which is chapter 11, which, if you're in your Eitz Chaim Chumash, is on page 636, and in any other Chumash will be wherever chapter 11 of the book of Leviticus can be found.
So we avoided the parasha the last week because of the...
Correct. Because of Chol HaMoed Pesach, the Shabbat for Chol HaMoed Pesach, we didn't continue the normal cycle. We had a special Torah reading just for last Shabbat, exactly. It interrupts the usually scheduled Parshiyot. All right. So, who'd like to read it? We're going to sort of go through the categories of kashrut a little bit quickly. We're not going to take too much time to take them apart, to digest them. Get it? Kashrut, digest. All right, work with me, people. Okay, so who'd like to lead us through a bit? This is English, remember? Don't be afraid. Eric, sure.
On the 8th day, Moses called Aaron.
Oh. Chapter 11.
Where are we?
We're in chapter 11.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. You were starting at the beginning of Shemini, which is good, but not where we're going to be focusing on for this class. So we're on page 636.
Here we go.
Okay,
Sorry.
right at the bottom of the page.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. These are the creatures that you may eat from among all the land animals. Any animals that have true hoofs, with clefts through the hoofs, and that chews the cud, such you may eat."
All right, let's just make sure we got that basic category down. If it's a land animal, what are we looking for? Cleft hoof and chewing cud, which gives us such animals as cow, sheep, goat, deer,
Horse.
giraffe.
Horse.
What's that?
Horse.
Horse? Really? What shape is a horse's foot?
It doesn't have a, I know, well, I know that.
Right, so horses on the other side. Horses in the category of non-kosher, along with such other animals as camels, squirrels,
Lamb.
dogs, cats, because they don't have hooves at all, right? So not only do they not have a split hoof, they don't even have a hoof. So you've got to have a hoof, and then it's got to be a split hoof, and then you've got to chew your cud. If you got a split hoof without chewing your cud, you're a pig. Exactly. That's an animal with a split hoof that doesn't chew its cud.
The giraffe is kosher.
The giraffe is a kosher animal, yes.
It's just hard to.
Yeah, you just need a really big ladder. Okay, or some good rope setup. Anyway,
They're not comfortable.
all right, you're not going to find it in your average kosher butcher shop, but it is technically a kosher species of animal. Okay, that doesn't mean you have to run out and eat a giraffe. I don't recommend that, but in a pinch, if you were running across the savannah and there was a giraffe over here and a warthog over here, you should be trying to catch the giraffe.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Good luck on that one.
Yeah. Well, you know. All right. Keep going.
The following, however, of those that either chew the cud or have true hoofs, you shall not eat.
That is to say, that have an either or rather than an and. That is to say, they match one but not the other.
The camel, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is impure for you. The daemon, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is impure for you. The hare, although it chews the cud, it has no true hoofs. It is impure for you. And the swine, although it has true hoofs with the hoofs cleft through, it does not chew the cud. It is impure for you. You shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses. They are impure for you.
All right. So, why don't we eat these animals? Wait. Say that louder so everyone could hear.
They're impure.
Because they are impure. Yes? Okay. So, I want to make sure we have a clear understanding of the logical fallacy of that statement. All right, so we have the prohibited animals, right? And God prohibits them by calling them impure, or tameh, for you. And then we reason that the reason God made them prohibited was because they were impure. Okay? This is a form of circular reasoning that the Torah itself does not say. It can lend itself to that interpretation, and we're going to wrestle with that throughout much of the rest of the discussion. But it is not automatically true that these animals are impure in and of themselves. That is to say, did God prohibit eating pigs because pigs are impure? Or are pigs impure because God prohibited us to eat them?
Because he prohibited.
Right. Well, but that's the debate we're going to be wading into, and some of the ramifications of that debate will come out in our discussion. So don't jump to a conclusion just yet. But I wanted to point out that the idea that there is something inherently wrong with these animals, as described by the word tameh or impure, is not 100% logical slam dunk at this stage of the game. Okay? Okay. So, let's keep going.
These you may eat of all that live in water, anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales. Those you may eat. But anything in the seas or in the streams that has no fins and scales, among all the swarming things of the water, and among all the other living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. And an abomination for you they shall remain. You shall not eat of their flesh, you shall not abominate their carcasses. Everything in water that has no fins and scales should be an abomination for you.
All right, so when we go from land to water, what do we get to eat? Fish with fins and scales. So that means salmon, yes, and that means lobster, no. Right? And all the other various examples that we can come up with. Why? At the moment, it seems to be because God said so. God is being awfully parsimonious with explanation at this point. The detail is going into making sure we can identify what we can and can't eat, not providing supporting theory behind why this or that was chosen, but simply that this is what you will not eat. Make sense?
It's the same word, we have two different English words. It says one is an impure and the other is abomination.
They are different words in
They are
Hebrew,
different.
yes.
Okay, they are, so then that's two distinct.
They are different words, absolutely. And the word abomination is a tricky one to translate because it can mean something which is intrinsically bad. It can also mean something which has been put outside of the realm of the acceptable for your community. And it's not 100% crystal clear, again, slam dunk, which category we're talking about here. So yeah, God's playing the cards close to his chest, if that's an appropriate metaphor. Okay, onward.
The following you shall abominate among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties of raven, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, and the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopoe, and the bat. All wings swarm.
Pause there. That list, by the way, is the best guess of the translator. There are some of the names of the birds that are prohibited that are a little unclear to us now, and they were unclear 500 years ago, and they were unclear almost 2,000 years ago as well when the Mishnah and the Talmud was being written, which is why we have a custom of not eating a bird that we don't have an accepted tradition that it isn't one of these. Okay, so because there's a little bit of debate about exactly which species is identified by each of these words, we hedge our bets and say if we know we can eat it because we've been eating it, then it's okay. And if we haven't been eating it, we're not going to start eating it. Make sense? So if we were to suddenly discover a new species of bird, we would be disinclined to eat that bird because we wouldn't be sure. Maybe it was what was on the list. Were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So how did the powers that be determine that turkey was okay to eat, since I'm sure it was not known to Jews 2,000 years ago?
With great trial and tribulation. Actually, the story of how the turkey became kosher is a very long and convoluted one, which basically begins with a mistake. They mistakenly believed that turkey had already been approved and eaten by other people before realizing that the word they were using for turkey to describe in another country was actually a different bird than what was being found in the New World, and therefore, by all accounts, we probably shouldn't have eaten turkey when we first met it, but we thought it was already approved, and so we started eating it, and then once we had already started eating it, now we have a tradition that we're eating it, so now we can continue eating it.
Oh my God.
And it's a vulture.
Well, taxonomy is not important, so it doesn't matter where the biologists put it. What matters is where the Torah puts it. And on the other hand, of course, we have some reason to suspect that God would not have been prohibiting a bird to our ancestors in the Sinai that they were unlikely to ever come across because they weren't going to get on a boat and sail to the New World. So there's a much longer discussion than that for the turkey, but a very interesting one to find the turkey's pedigree.
That's sexy.
Could we safely assume that most of these are birds of prey?
It certainly seems to be that most of the birds are birds of prey. There are also in the Talmud. Oh, let's drag it back to the one conversation at a time. There's also a discussion in the Talmud about trying to identify signs for the birds, having to do with their toe construction and other things. So the rabbis don't just leave it as, oh, the rabbis do try to uncover telltale signs that will tell us what birds are or are not kosher by deduction or induction, more precisely. But it is still tricky when you come across a new species. And simply saying, well, it's not a bird of prey, isn't really, work. I mean, after all, what makes a duck not a bird of prey? I mean, what's that? Webbed feet, but I mean, ducks eat snails. I mean, aren't they preying on snails?
I didn't know that.
Yep, absolutely. Hang around ducks, you'll see them. What's that?
I thought they ate fish.
Oh, they'll eat just about anything.
I like the lemons.
Okay, let's keep going.
All winged swarming things that walk on fours shall be an abomination to you. But these you may eat among all the winged swarming things that walk on fours. All that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. All of these you may eat the following: locusts of every variety, all varieties of bald locusts, crickets of every variety, all varieties of grasshoppers. But all of the winged swarming things that have four legs shall be an abomination.
All right, so everybody, I'm sure, is going to run out and start checking the local locusts. But yes, there are varieties of insect species which are kosher. And there are some communities, not many, that do still have the traditions of which ones are and aren't. And there was a recent locust storm in Israel, which some people saw as a flying smorgasbord. So yes, this is a halacha that is alive. I wouldn't exactly call it well, because it's not widely observed, but it certainly is has a good pedigree in the Torah of these animals, or insects. Okay? So, just in case you were going to be translating the word abomination, which might be more rightly so in the cultural context as the word disgusting rather than abomination, I imagine most of us would feel disgusted at the thought of eating bugs. But that disgust comes not from Torah. That disgust comes from our American, Western European sensibilities. Nothing wrong with them. They do a pretty good job for a lot of things, but they're not 100% the same thing. So the Torah thinks some bugs are okay. Americans pretty much think no bugs are okay. Okay? Okay. All right. Now, we are going to skip the issues of the different contamination back and forth of what happens if the bodies touch this or that, because I want to get to the crux of the matter. So we're going to skip to page 642, and I want to just start at the top, verse 41. Yes, go ahead.
All the things that swarm upon the earth are an abomination. They shall not be. You shall not eat among all things that swarm upon the earth. Anything that crawls on its belly, or anything that walks on fours, or anything that has many legs, for they are an abomination. You shall not throw abomination upon yourselves through anything that swarms. You shall not make yourself impure therewith, and thus become impure. For I, the Lord, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves impure through any swarming things that moves upon the earth. For I, the Lord, am he who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy.
Okay. So why aren't we eating these things? Louder, louder.
For holiness sake.
For holiness sake. But that brings us back to our question. do we get holy by not eating these things because they are the opposite of holiness and we would be contaminated by them? Or do we become holy by not eating these things because we are observing Torah? And that is the path to holiness. Don't jump to a conclusion. The latter may seem a little more convincing to us at the moment, but let's wrestle with that. Because that verse 43, which you're welcome to look at in here, but I've copied onto the handout as well, has a little wiggle room for Midrash. You may have noticed as we were reading through, or maybe you've just become inured to it, that it seemed a little repetitive. Right? The verse 43, you shall not draw abomination upon yourselves through anything that swarms. You shall not make yourselves impure therewith, and thus become impure. Well, yeah, right? I mean, you shouldn't make yourself impure and become impure. Well, isn't that what become impure means? Why do I have to say you shouldn't become impure and make yourself impure? Notice a little redundancy there? And as is often the case, whenever there is redundancy, there is room for midrash. And there's a very famous midrash that comes in the Talmud on exactly this point. If someone would like to help us with the handout, we're going to start at the second paragraph. The first paragraph is just the quote that I just referred to, verse 43, so that we can have it for our discussion. Anyone want to hit that second paragraph for me? Thank you, Randy.
They taught in the Academy of Rabbi Ismael, transgression lose the heart of man. Neither should you make yourself unclean with them, that you should be made unclean thereby. Do not read the letter, for that you should be made unclean. In that way, but as though they bore vowels to heal, that you should become pure.
All right. Nice and clear?
Yeah.
Read the next, Ibn Ezra gives us a little bit more explanation, then we'll go back and take it apart.
Some say they, Amen, Benimetem, are two different roots, it meaning being, like a person who does not have wisdom. If so, then the verse should be translated, and do not make yourself impure to all them, and become foolish through them. Ibn Ezra.
Okay. So Ibn Ezra tries to clarify it a little bit. I imagine that if your Hebrew's not really great, this might still be a little bit unclear. But if you look at the second to last word in that the Hebrew line, right? V'nit metem. Sorry, I should probably write that in block letters, shouldn't I? It's much harder to write in block letters. And then just making sure I got that before I do the other version. V'nit metem, right? That's our basic word. Well, they're saying, well, if this is the word for tum'ah, for the word that we normally use to become impure, then we are missing an aleph. There should be an aleph. And there ain't one. Now we read it as though there was an aleph. That is to say, when we translate it, generally we translate it like there's an aleph. And in fact, if you go to the Samaritan version of the Chumash, they put an aleph in. The Samaritans are famous for editing the Torah to make things less complicated, and they fix the mistakes, as they put it. We don't fix our mistakes, we learn from them. And the rabbis say, well, wait, rather than believe that there should be an aleph there and that that's the only way to read it, what if we read it without the aleph, and instead of being tumah, we read it as being the tet mem mem, as being the root, which means to dull. And therefore you are dulling yourself by having consumed these things. All right, we're following the little wiggle there in the Midrash? So they're saying, it looks like there should be an aleph there, and it's easiest to read it like there's an aleph there, just like in the words prior. And if you look back 4 words from the end of the Hebrew, right? V'titma'u, right? You can see the aleph there right near the end. So they say, well, it's easy to do that, but if we take it at face value, without that aleph, it gives us a little bit more flexibility to interpret it. And now we're going to read it as being to dull yourself. So the question is, what does it mean to dull yourself by having eaten these things? Got it? Okay, so that is what we need to uncover, because this becomes a catchphrase, what's the right term? A jargon for a certain experience, a certain phenomenon. It's called timtum halev, which means to dull the heart. All right, and to understand what that sort of means and what that sort of feels, I brought a letter to the editor from Yatid Ne'eman, which is a Haredi, an ultra-Orthodox newspaper, which uses the term the way it's most commonly used in contemporary ultra-Orthodox society. So who would like to read a nice angry letter? You got to read it in an angry voice. Someone wants to...
Carry it around,
What's that?
but I'll read it.
Please.
Our Kohanim discussed these topics. They said that boys can lose their yiras, shomayim,
Their yiras shamayim, their yirat shamayim, their fear of heaven.
by not wearing yarmulkes. They spoke about
Timtum halev,
which comes from the wrong things going into one's mouth. When a boy is small, as his yarmulke falls off, how quickly do we run to put it back? Do we realize that this can spell difference between whether he will still be in yeshiva at 17, when we allow our daughters to eat cholosh stam?
Cholosh stam, which is, if you're not familiar with cholosh stam, is when you eat milk that was made by people that weren't Jews. Still kosher, but it's made by people that aren't Jews.
Chocolate bar. Do we realize the ramifications down the line on where this could lead? When our toddlers have fever and we give them Tylenol gel caps with trafe in it.
The issue being, of course, whether the gel is actually made from gelatin, which is often from trafe sources.
Why do we wonder that so many of our youth are falling by the wayside? These things are not opinions or thoughts. These are facts built into the creation since the first 6 days. Letter is published in Yatid Ne'eman.
Right. All right, so what's the theory here? This timtum halev, this dulling of the heart. If I eat a gel cap when I'm 2, what happens when I'm 17?
You may lose the fear of God.
I lose the fear of God. I go off the derech, as they say, which is quite the equivalent of off the deep end, which means I leave the ultra-Orthodox lifestyle. And it's all because of the treif I ate when I was 2. That chalav stam, that gelatin cap, or the kippah not being put back on my head as soon as possible, set up in motion a flaw within my soul that meant 10 years later, 15, 20 years later, I would move away from the true path. That's how the term timtum halev is used in many communities these days. But what's the basic premise then?
Stay with what you're supposed to do.
Well, the conclusion is stay with what you're supposed to do, but what's the premise about what happens when you eat one of these things?
It leads to negligence in following the rules of the Torah.
It leads to negligence. Why? What's the implication? Why is it leading to negligence?
There's lack of discipline.
Lack of discipline for a 2-year-old being given medicine?
No,
That 2-year-old should have known better.
No, but the parents show that 2-year-old that that's okay.
It's a mistake.
So that the parents are teaching the 2-year-old. I mean, what about the girl who's eating the chalav stam, the kosher candy bar, but it's made with milk that was from non-Jewish manufacturers? It's still kosher. She didn't transgress. What's wrong? And even the gel cap, most authorities say is perfectly permissible in this case because you're not ingesting it as food. So, although I should point out, by the way, this person obviously doesn't have a toddler because you don't give toddlers pills. It doesn't really work so well. But in any case, what he seems to be implying here is that there is some form of spiritual blemish that comes from these acts that compromises the spirit, that compromises the soul, whether it was permitted or not. All right, that seems to be the implication here. And it sets up a greater likelihood or in his particular rant, inevitability, of eventually throwing off Torah altogether. Does that make sense? I mean, making sense of the how to understand his letter, not does his position make sense? Because I think there may be some flaws with his position.
Is that a similar situation to the people that were spitting on that little girl in that community in Israel who had long sleeves and a long skirt?
Just not long enough.
Not long enough.
It's not precisely the same thing, because what Tzimtzum Halev has come to mean specifically is not just any transgression, but specifically the eating of something which is not perfect. And that it creates not just a transgression or potential transgression, or in this particular case he's using examples which happen to actually be permissible, but it creates a blemish within the spirit of the ingester. Even though a child had no reason not to do this, or had no say whether or not to do it, even though a child is technically not considered liable for their transgressions until reaching the age of bar mitzvah, the parents are considered liable, there is this theory that what happens to them in their infancy and youth sets up spiritual shockwaves that have lasting effect. It's almost as though it scars their soul to the point that they will eventually be drift away from Judaism. That's the theory. All right? So, lest you think that this rant is completely isolated, let's see how this implication could be spun out in another scenario. You want to keep reading for us?
Sure. When the Rambam visited Yemen.
So, this is a little bit earlier than 2009. We're talking about Rambam going to visit Yemen. So, we're talking 1,000 years ago.
He met a certain Gaon of the
A Gaon.
Gaon of the Geonim of the time.
All right, so a Gaon is literally a genius, but in this particular case it means a greatly revered leader of his community. And he may have been a genius too.
And after the Rambam returned home, this Gaon would regularly write him questions and answers.
And that was normal back then, right? And it still is today, although we tend to want the answers faster because we're sending them by email.
One time a letter reached him from the Gaon, and on his page was a deep question in philosophy. The Rambam was much astounded at this question, and he said, "I don't understand how this is so, that a question like this could arise in the mind of a Jew. For questions such as this do not arise in the Jew mind until his soul is in pure soul." And the Rambam refrained from answering him regarding this question.
All right, now is Rambam an opponent of philosophy? No, far from it. Rambam is one of the greats of Jewish philosophy, and of understanding philosophy from the Muslims and the Aristotelians, and then synthesizing it into something that worked with Judaism. So it's not that he is afraid of philosophical questions. What he feels, however, is that this question is what we call apikoros, that this question would be heresy. That if he was asking something about, well, doesn't this prove that God doesn't exist? Or doesn't this prove that God never created the world and that the universe is eternal, which is an Aristotelian belief? That would be a big problem. And what this story about Rambam is saying, I should point out already at the beginning, this story is not contained in Rambam's own writings, would be, if someone's asking a question like that, then their soul has already become impure. Because a pure Jewish soul would never think to ask such a thing. Got it so far? All right, let's finish up the story.
After some length of time, this fellow continued sending many letters, until the Rambam felt that he had to answer him. And his answer to the Gaon was, "Go and check the slaughterers and the inspectors in your community."
Go and check the slaughterer? He's asking a philosophical question, perhaps one that is heretical. And the answer is, go check the shochet? Go check the slaughterer?
Upon receiving this letter, the Gaon followed the instructions of the Rambam, and then was revealed that for 13 years they had fed him and the entire city nevelos and trefot.
Nevelot and trefot, which would mean kosher, unkosher meat, carcasses and things that had been improperly slaughtered.
Such that even a Gaon such as himself came up with a question of minus and apicurus.
That's minut in modern Sephardic, and apikoros is still apikoros. That is to say, these are words for blasphemy and heresy. So, why did this great Gaon, this great leader of his community, suddenly start asking questions that were heretical?
Because he was already impure for what he been eating for such a long time.
Because he'd been eating treif for 13 years. Now, did he go like to McDonald's or the equivalent in Yemen in his day and have a cheeseburger? No, was he sitting down to a nice pork sandwich every day? Did he, order his wife to cook on Shabbos? No. Why was he eating treif?
That's a salad.
Because the shochet was cheating. And by the way, I don't know if you've been following the Jewish news, but there's been a big brouhaha out in Los Angeles where kosher packaging has been used for non-kosher meat, and the shochets in LA are in really big trouble. So not all of them, don't spread rumors, but if you're going out to LA, investigate it if you're going anytime soon to make sure that the sources are legit, because the investigation is turning up more and more problems. The news is still breaking, so we're not entirely sure how far it goes. But it is a problem historically from time to time that a shochet will cheat, because it's usually cheaper to cheat, which means you increase your profits. That is always a problem. But apart from the issue of the shochet here, what is the theory that this story that was brought by the Briskers about Rambam, what is it trying to say, theoretically, philosophically?
Eating proper unkosher meal can affect you spiritually.
Eating unkosher meat can affect you spiritually, whether you knew it or not. Okay, that's what the Briskers are trying to say with this story, is that if you sit down to have your lovely dinner and it's been properly cooked in proper kosher pots, and somewhere down the road or back down the road, some shochet did it wrong, whether it was intentionally in order to cheat or whether it was unintentionally and the shochet just made a mistake, by the time it reaches your pot and your belly, your soul is becoming harmed by this food. Okay? Do you understand the position? I see a couple of skeptical glances. Anyone like to comment on the position?
Is there any way to repair it?
Is there any way to repair it? Which we might also ask about the 2-year-old. It's like, well, wait a minute. If this leaves this spiritual scar, how do you heal it? How do you fix it? I mean, Rambam at least seems to be saying that by investigating the shochet, that this was able to be rectified and the Gaon was able to get back on the right path. Or I should point out, again, the Briskers are saying that this is what happened to Rambam. But it doesn't quite fit with many of Rambam's other teachings, and we'll maybe have time to go into as we continue. Other questions or comments on this, though?
Seems to be trying to instill belief by causing fear.
It seems to be sort of instilling the belief that we should keep kosher
Yes.
by causing a certain fear that if we don't keep kosher.
Sort of a regret.
Okay, well, if you go back, and that's a very good point, Sally, if you go back to the top of the first page, the second paragraph, where it's talking about the teaching of Rabbi Ishmael, transgression dulls the heart of man. This is the origin of this phrase of timtum halev, to dull the heart. Does he say eating non-kosher things dulls the heart? What is the word he used? What is the word he uses? Transgression. And this becomes then the nub of the issue, right? So an avera, a transgression, or for the sake of not having to write as long a word, sin. It's convenient when I don't have to write as much. Is it the sin itself and its physical effect or substance that does the dulling, or is it the action and intent? That's the problem. Which one is it, according to Rabbi Ishmael, that dulls the heart, that causes this timtum halev? I don't know. Rabbi Ishmael doesn't say. Okay? Rabbi Ishmael doesn't say, which is why we have so much room for interpretation. So the line of argument from the text that I've been bringing so far has been focused on this, that these specific sins, and since the phrase happens to come at the issue around the issues of kashrut, is why it picks up this feel of eating, these particular sins have a physical effect, that there is something in the substance themselves that causes the damage that he is warning us about. But we could read it that it's not the quality of the sin, that is to say, the thing that is being used to sin, but it is a quality of the sinning that is dulling the heart. That the act of disregarding kashrut, the act of transgression, the act of rejecting God's mitzvot as being part of our lives, the giving in to temptation, whether it be to eat something tasty or whether it be to sell something treif in order to make more of a profit, that repetitive act or acting is what is dulling the heart of the transgressor.
So the logical next step, if that is the case, then one's intent is called into question, because you're not having the intent of holding fast to Torah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're forsaking that holding fast, leading to the repeated actus reus. Because in many ways you put a criminal law analysis
Mm-hmm.
on this with the actus reus versus the mens rea.
What were you actually doing? What were you thinking you were
Actus
doing?
reus, the mens rea. And so you wouldn't, but part of that that carries to the next step is you would not have those acts if you were holding fast to Torah.
Well, and so that comes back to our question about the Brisker story for Rambam, which is the Gaon was becoming someone who was going to transgress and was becoming heretical with no intention whatsoever of violating the commandments, purely because he was being fed something. That was a violation.
I also just to compare that to and contrast it with the whole Epicurean philosophy, which is you are what you eat.
And are we?
It's very much the Greek Epicureans had this whole system of proteins versus this whole diet.
Right.
Really looked at that, at different types of ways of preparation of food.
And what does Judaism say? Are we what we eat, or are we how we eat? That is to say, is our spiritual character determined by the food that goes into our mouth, whether it's by mistake or not? Or does our spiritual character get determined by how we choose what to put in our mouth?
Or is it both?
Or is it both?
You have to ask the question fully, which is it either or both?
Well, let's take a look at a few more texts, and we'll hopefully be able to come to a better understanding, or at least one understanding. All right. Someone else like to take over? We're at the top of top of the back page. The milk of a non-Jew. Who here's a big advocate of nursing? Maybe that is to say, nursing a baby kind of nursing. No volunteers. No one wants to touch this with a 10-foot ball. Thank you, please.
The milk of a non-Jew is like the milk of a Jewess.
All right, so let's make sure that we understand the Shulchan Aruch, which is where this is taken from, says very clearly the milk of a non-Jew is as kosher as the milk of a Jew. Right? We're talking breast milk here. We're not talking milk in the cow. That's covered in other sections. This particular section is talking about breast milk. So if you got a jar of breast milk from a non-Jew and you got a jar of breast milk from a Jew, their kosher status is the same. However, or nevertheless,
a child should not nurse from a Gentile woman if it is possible to arrange it through a Jewish woman. The milk of non-Jews dulls the heart.
That's our phrase, timtum halev again. Keep going.
The woman who is nursing, even a Jewess, should not be allowed to eat forbidden things, and certainly the child as well. It will harm him when he is older.
All right, so Shulchan Aruch seems to be saying if the mother is eating things that are forbidden for a child, or if the wet nurse is eating things that are forbidden for a Jewish child, that somehow the milk is going to enter the child and somehow contaminate this timtum halev, dull the heart. It will be worse for him when he's older. This will be a problem. Yes? One.
That again is a threat.
It seems to be a bit of a threat, right?
Yes.
Don't let it happen, or else, you know, and when he's 17 and runs off to join the bandit army, you're going to say, I never should have had that goyish wet nurse.
That's right.
That's what did it. It wasn't the daily beatings. It wasn't because I made him go to work when he was 5 years old. It wasn't because I never taught him Torah properly. It must have been the wet nurse. Right, yeah.
Isn't that very close to the Twinkie defense?
The Twinkie defense. It was the milk that made me do it. Well, you had milk this morning? No, I had milk when I was a small infant. And it was from the wrong person, or my mother was eating something treif at the time, and that's why I grew up to be a Rasha. That's why I grew up to be a bad person. Well, who here tried to use that as a defense of the wicked son at their Seder? Can we still repair it? Well, that's a very good question, which I'm not going to answer yet. But I want to keep going on to another source. Let's drive this point home.
But some say that when his mother was pregnant with him, she passed by some heathen temples and smelled their particular kind of incense, and that odor pierced her body like the poison of a snake.
All right, so this is taken from the Rishalmi. The he in question is Elisha ben Abuya, also known as Acher. If you've read the book As a Driven Leaf, you know something of his story. Elisha ben Abuya was a great rabbi who fell off the path, who became a heretic. This is way back in the time of the great rabbis and around the Second Temple period, post, and he became a complete heretic. And the explanation given to the Rishalmi, among many, there are many competing explanations of what happened to him, was, well, you know why he turned out like that? His mother smelled the incense of idolaters while she was pregnant, and boom, straight into the baby, stemmed the soul. Well, you know, he was in her longer than he was in his father, so there's an explanation. Again, it's not the only explanation they use for Acher. I don't believe that was the explanation used in Driven Leaf either. What's that? The guy, yeah, which is the more common, although there's also a more philosophical explanation involving mysticism. But the one that most people focus on for his explanation of his rejection of God is that he saw a child climbing a tree at his father's request to take the fillings from a nest, and he shoo away the mother's bird. Both obeying your parents and shooing away the mother bird are stated in the Torah as guaranteeing long life. And on the way down the ladder, he fell and died. And Elisha ben Abuya said, there must be no God, there must be no judgment. Because God promised long life for both of these things, and here's this kid lying dead in front of me. It's all pointless. Let's have a ham sandwich.
But his opinions were still written.
And he's a
the
very
other.
important recurring character
Yes.
in after that point and throughout the rest of the Talmud. But that's another class. But for their point of the moment, there seems to be at least one more opinion that says, yes, what happens to even a child in utero can have an effect on their spiritual destiny. So we've gone all the way from 2-year-old gel caps to nursing at the mother to in utero, and now we're going to have pre-utero.
Now therefore please beware, and drink no wine nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For you will conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel out of the hand of the Philistines.
Name that hero.
Samson.
Samson. Exactly. Samson. Shimshon. So even before Samson was conceived, his mother was receiving instructions about not to eat anything that was wine or strong drink or anything impure. All right, pretty powerful proof text, right? Well, we got some other problems with this when we look at actual what we do, that is to say halakha. Because think for a moment. Imagine you are an extremely careful, superstitious person, right? And you spill salt. What are you going to do? You are going, I can see people making the gestures, but no one on the camera can. You are going to throw some over your shoulder, right? I mean, it's not like, should I, shouldn't I, oh, I feel silly doing this. You are absolutely going to do it. If the notion of Timtum Halev falls on this side, that the physical qualities of the food that are being eaten, the food that is being eaten, leaves an indelible spiritual scar, even in utero or as a small child that had no choice in what they were doing or had no knowledge of what they were doing, what would you expect would be the case for how you would stock your pantry or lay your table?
With extreme care.
With extreme care. With extreme care, right? You would be so careful with everything that moved into your mouth, because if it is leaving this kind of spiritual scar, a spiritual blemish that you may not even be aware of, so how can you get rid of it? You are going to be careful. Like, I'm only going to eat the food from my own garden kind of careful. And yet, go ahead and keep reading for us just for the sake of time. And I like your voice.
Said Rav Anan, said Samuel, an Israelite who is an apostate with regard to idolatry. One may eat from what he slaughtered. Let us say this supports his view, and the ravens brought him, that is Elijah, bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening. And said Rav Judah, said Rav, they brought him meat from Ahab's butchers.
Okay. Let's unpack this. Eliyahu Hanavi, everybody had a nice little hopeful visit from him on Pesach, right? We were hoping that he'd show up and answer a few questions for us. But not at my table, but we still asked. Who was Ahab?
He drank the wine.
What's that?
He drank the glass of wine.
Well, who was Ahab?
No,
Bad
He
king.
was the king of Israel.
Bad king.
Bad
Bad king. Look what you did on the carpet. Bad king. He was a terrible king, married to a rather terrible lady known as Jezebel. And Elijah had been fighting against them to try and sway the people of the northern tribes back to God. And he had moments of success, but much of his career was spent in frustration. And much of it was spent in hiding. And while he was hiding, what did he eat? Hint, hint, hint. Bread and meat brought by ravens. Where did the meat come from? How do we know it was kosher meat?
I guess we don't know.
I mean, did they fly in with a little hechsher on the packs of meat? You know, a little OU 2,000 years ago?
They're bringing some meat, some fish, something.
Well, we could say, well, maybe they brought him a whole fish, or maybe we're not, but that's not the rule, not the line that this opinion of the Talmud takes, which is, no. The ravens were actually stealing food from Ahab's pantry, from his butcher, and bringing it to him. Even though you might think that the meat that had been prepared by an idolater would be unfit, even though it had gone through the proper slaughtering process. Nevertheless, it is permitted under these circumstances. If there was a physical effect, a stain on the soul from eating something that either was or potentially was treif, would Elijah eat something that ravens were dropping out of the sky for him?
If God told him it was okay.
If God told him it was okay. Okay.
Elijah would have that conversation.
So, what we can go for is say, well, Elijah was a prophet. And that helps. that removes an awful lot of doubt when you can just pick up the phone and say, hi God, I got your delivery here, but the labels seem to fall off in transit. Can you confirm that this is kosher? And therefore we're okay. But let's take a look at the next text.
During the 7 years when they conquered the land.
That is to say, the Israelites, when they entered the land of Israel under Joshua.
At that time, unclean things were permitted to them.
A little known fact. There's a perk of living back then.
As it is written, and houses full of all good things, in Deuteronomy. And said Rav Jeremiah bar Abba, said Rav, this means they ate even bacon.
Okay? During the time of the conquest, according to rabbinic understanding, as the army was moving through, and as they were looting the towns and houses of the people of Canaan, they were permitted to eat what they found. They were permitted to enjoy the gold, they were permitted to get the clothes, and they were permitted to eat what they found.
An army moves on its stomach.
An army moves on its stomach is exactly the idea behind this, which might also undermine it as a proof text. Because if we're saying it's because the army had to keep moving fast and if they had to wait for the kosher slaughter to catch up with them, then they would have lost some of the momentum of being an army. And so maybe this was only permitted to them during this time of conquest for 7 years because they had to move fast for 7 years. Okay, we can maybe work with that.
Who gave them the permission?
Who gave them the permission? God. Because God said that they would be able to take the houses full of all good things. Therefore, everything there was okay. So because of the wording of Deuteronomy, that was where they got their permission to do so.
And Joshua was still the leader at that time, Joshua.
Yes, although the rabbis certainly understood that this notion of when the Israelites went to war in later generations still applied.
Oh, okay.
That if they needed to, they could eat from non-kosher sources while they were engaged in the war. But again, maybe that's only a wartime permission.
Right.
Maybe that's because if you stop to wait for the hechsher to catch up to you, you're not going to be able to pursue the war and you will get killed, or more of you will get killed than necessary. So maybe it's just a protection.
And doesn't this open the gates for other times?
Well, that's the conflict, which is if you believe that the act of eating something that is treif leaves a lasting spiritual imprint on your soul, then you are going to be exceedingly careful about everything you eat in every circumstance. And you are never going to let yourself slip, certainly not on purpose, and you're going to be so careful about not slipping by mistake that it's beyond reasonable suspicion. And that's a good thing, to a certain extent. You know, as a rabbi, I'm of two minds on that. If it motivates people to be careful enough in what they are eating, to tell them that there is a spiritual blemish that will come to them or to their children, if that's a good enough way to make sure they're careful about what they're eating, it's a tempting proposition. Because we certainly know that most current Jews are not exactly what you would call careful with their kashrut. Some may indeed have limits of what they will and won't eat. I know many Jews will not touch pork or bacon, or Rashi, they won't touch pork, but they might touch bacon. But they wouldn't eat oysters, but they will have a cheeseburger. Some do have different standards in different categories, and that it is important to remember that kashrut is a cluster of mitzvot, not just one monolithic mitzvah. So it is possible for someone to keep some of the mitzvot of kashrut, even if they don't keep all of them. But if there was a way to convince them of the spiritual harm that was going to stick to their soul and lead them into badness later in life, that is a tempting line of argument. That is a tempting thing to preach from the bima, right? Think for a second about the spilling of the salt. If the idea was that salt is so important that if you spill it, it is a shan, if that is the right word for wherever that superstition originated, that it is a this tragedy and a shame, and you have to compound it by throwing some more away, aren't you going to be more careful with your salt in the future? Aren't you going to make sure that that salt, pot is well closed and not in any place where it might be knocked over? So the superstitions, the bad luck motivation can be extremely powerful, very, very compelling. And I sometimes I am convinced that if God had simply told us to keep the mitzvot because it was good luck, and if we do the other ones, they're bad luck, you'd have more Jews who were keeping mitzvahs today. But is it true? Is it real? Is this Timtum Halev in the way that it is being conceived of by the rant on the first page about the gel caps and the chocolate bar, is that truly, I just want to make sure I got his words, these things are not opinions or thoughts, these are facts built into creation since the first 6 days? I don't believe so. I don't believe so. And I think the very last phrase there, the short 4 words, is pretty much the explanation why. Remember, we go back to our discussion of the chicken soup and the little fleck of whipped cream or milk or whatever that goes flying across the kitchen. If it is less than 1/60th of the volume of the soup, and you were not putting it in on purpose, right? This is not an excuse to put in a minute amount of dairy on purpose. This is a question of whether or not something drops in by complete accident that is less than 1/60th of the volume of the remainder of the product. What is the status of the soup? Kosher. Kosher. If it was going to leave a spiritual scar, don't you think the Talmud would have said, don't touch it? The Talmud is full of discussions that provide leniency, that provide leeway, that provide ways to understand and deal with doubtful situations that categorically result in eating something treif. The most famous example is if you have a stack of steaks over here that are all kosher, and you've got one steak over here that isn't kosher, and as you were arranging them for whatever reason, there was an earthquake and they all got mixed up, you can eat all of them. I wouldn't suggest it at one sitting, but you can eat all of them. Now, you know one of them is treif. It's not a maybe treif. You know one of those 11 steaks is treif. But if they have become mixed beyond separation, you didn't have like a big T marked on one of them or something, you can eat all of them. And if there was going to be a spiritual scar that would reverberate throughout the rest of your life, leading you further and further away from God, I really do believe the Talmud would have warned us, you know what? Don't eat them. Because you will absolutely be eating something that is treif. I believe very, very strongly that the notion that Rabbi Ishmael was talking about at the beginning, about transgression dulling the heart, is absolutely true. Every time we transgress, it takes us further and further away from God. Every time we transgress, it does damage us temporarily. It bruises us in our spiritual existence. But not because of what we ingested, but because we ingested, because we chose to eat it. And so if we eat something that is treif unknowingly, I don't think the story the Briskers brought is true. I don't think it makes us become heretics because we unwittingly ate something that was treif. Just as I'm not worried for the souls of the Jews who live in LA that have been eating treif meat from these criminal butchers. I don't believe their souls have been damaged. I believe the butcher's souls have an awful lot of damage to make up for with an awful lot of tshuva, an awful lot of repentance. But the people who unknowingly ate the meat that they believed was under proper supervision and was being properly prepared and was properly kosher, I don't believe they've been stained by this. They might be a little mistrustful of their next shochet, the next butcher, but that's a different kind of scar.
Then it's our carelessness, what purpose?
It's our callousness, it's the casual way that we can begin to reject more and more once we get used to it. You know, the first time you break a commandment and you don't get hit by lightning, makes you a lot easier, a lot more willing to do something else. I mean, we see this all the time with youngsters that are learning how to drive and new drivers. That every time they go out and drive their car in a reckless way and don't die, they are encouraged to do it again and again and again and again. You know, if you got in that car and the first time you broke the speed limit, you hit a tree, you probably wouldn't break the speed limit again. But if you can get away with it once and twice and 3 and 4 times, and there's no crash, there's no police, there's no damage, there's no scolding, you know, it builds up itself, a layer of willingness to just keep stepping across that barrier, across that line. And I believe that's what Rabbi Yishmael was talking about. And I believe that the idea of timtum halev, of dulling the heart as a physical, spiritual blemish, is a very compelling metaphor for convincing people not to eat something that is treif. To say that this is more than just a rule, but this is your very soul in your hands in a way that is tangible. And I can appreciate why that would work so well for so many. But if we want to get down to brass tacks, it is our soul in our hands when we choose to do or not do what God has asked. And we don't need the spiritual boogeyman to make that meaningful. With that, have a wonderful day, and I'll take a couple additional questions off the air.